All right, so we're diving into large-scale React apps with this deep dive. We're looking at building large-scale web apps, a React field guide from 2024 by Osmani and Hassan.
Yeah, this isn't like a React 101 kind of book. This is for when things get serious.
Definitely. And they get right to it, challenging what large scale even means. They say it's not just, how many lines of code you've got, but the whole development complexity, how teams work together, keeping things maintainable over time.
That's spot on. One person could make a huge app, theoretically, but keeping it running, adding features with like 50 other developers, that's different.
Totally different beast. It's like baking a cake versus running a bakery with 50 pastry chefs, all wanting to use the same oven. And on that note of keeping things manageable, the book talks about managing complexity a lot.
And they make this distinction between essential complexity and accidental complexity, which I found really interesting. We often add complexity to projects without even realizing it, they argue.
Right, like give a kid a hammer and everything's the nail. Right. We overcomplicate with the tools we're comfy with.
Exactly. And that's where they bring in this thing called the Cinefin framework. It's like a way to categorize a problem to decide if it's simple or complicated or complex, even chaotic, helps you figure out the right way to approach it.
So you don't like try to jam a complex solution onto a simple problem or vice versa.
I like that. It reminds me of this one app I worked on, tons of real-time data, and we tried to shoehorn it into a really simple database structure. We were in way over our heads. The Cinefin framework would have helped us avoid that mess.
Perfect example.
Yeah.
Okay, so modularity. The book is big on building with small, reusable components.
Yeah, and there's a good reason for that. Modularity, it's super important for large-scale React. Think of it like building a car, right? It's much easier if you're dealing with the engine, the transmission, the wheels, all as separate things. You can test them individually, replace one without ripping the whole car apart.
They even quote Justin Meyer, who said they build apps like Legos, small, testable pieces you can put together. Love that. But how would you actually break down, say, a complex UI, like a blog post, into those smaller components?
So you've got your blog post, right? You've got the header with the author's name and date, maybe some social media icons. That's a component right there. Then the actual content, that could be its own component, maybe with subcomponents for if there are images or videos or quotes. And then the comments section, another component.
Like you're taking this huge thing and making it into smaller, more manageable chunks. Development and maintenance would be so much easier.
Exactly. And the book takes that idea even further with lazy loading, which is all about loading components only when you need them.
Right. They were really into that. They used the analogy of a buffet. You don't pile your whole plate at once, so why should your app load everything at once?
It's like if you have an e-commerce app with hundreds of products. With lazy loading, you just load the components for, say, the shoe page when someone actually goes to that page. Makes that initial load time so much faster.
Makes sense. And it's all about that optimization, especially with how important JavaScript execution time is these days. They get into that too.
Yeah, they talk about how it used to be all about making download times faster, but now execution time is a big bottleneck. Apps are just more complex.
Like you can get a book delivered to your door super fast, but can you actually read it that quickly? The information's got to get processed.
Yeah.
And they point out how important that is for people on like slower phones or bad internet.
And to do that, they say you got to understand how the browser even handles JavaScript, avoiding those tasks that bog everything down, using caching mechanisms. Even understanding how V8, the JavaScript engine, optimizes things. It's a lot.
It's getting really deep, which is probably why they bring up design systems as a way to, I don't know, wrangle all that.
Oh, design systems are key. It's like a single source of truth for your app, button styles, the fonts you use, how components work, accessibility guidelines. Everything's there.
Yeah, they actually quote Emma Boston. She's an engineering manager at Spotify, and she calls design systems the solution to two big challenges: accessibility and consistency, especially when you've got a lot of people working on a project.
Totally. And it's more than just making things look pretty, though that's important. It also helps developers. Imagine having a library of pre-built components ready to go, saves so much time, and makes sure the whole app feels consistent.
Love it. But components are useless without data. And they dig into data fetching. They're big fans of React Query.
Oh yeah, React Query is great, especially for bigger apps with lots of data. It handles all the tricky stuff for you, caching, background updates, even things like pagination and optimistic updates.
Okay, now I'm lost.
Uh,
What are optimistic updates?
so let's say someone's leaving a comment on a social media post, right? Optimistic updating would mean the UI shows that comment instantly, even before the server confirms it went through. It feels much smoother for the user, especially if there's any lag.
Ah, so it's like the app is anticipating what's going to happen and just doing it.
Yeah,
Smart.
exactly. And React Query just makes it so much easier to implement things like that, which is why they really recommend it.
Sounds essential. And speaking of essential tools, they talk about state management, from basic useState to the big one, Redux. What's their take on that whole debate?
Well, they say it depends. Like, useState is great for simpler stuff. They compare it to a to-do list. But when you've got a really complex app with data flowing everywhere, you need something more heavy duty.
Which is where Redux comes in. It's like that central store for all your data, right? Keeps things from getting mutated and causing bugs.
Right. And they quote Jeffrey Peng from DoorDash, who says that Redux's role is changing, especially with server-side rendering and tools like Next.js becoming more common.
So the way we manage state on the client side needs to adapt. They're big on using the right tool for the job. Sometimes you don't need Redux, sometimes you do.
Yeah, it's about being practical. And on that note, they also talk about code organization, which I feel like often gets ignored.
Yes, a whole section on that. And thank goodness, because I've seen some code bases that are just a nightmare. How do you keep things from becoming chaotic?
Well, they say there's no one right answer, but having consistent conventions is key. They talk about common pitfalls like ending up with this utils folder that's just random code snippets or components scattered all over the place.
Ugh, the worst. I once spent ages looking for a function, and it was buried in a folder called miscellaneous.
Exactly. They prefer more structure, like organizing by feature or by domain.
Right, they talk about both.
Right.
Remind me what the difference is again.
So feature-based is grouping by what the code does, like a login folder or a search folder, that sort of thing. Domain-based is more about the business logic, so users, products, that kind of organization. Both work. It depends on the project and how your team thinks.
So find what works and stick to it. And good documentation probably helps a lot with that too.
Huge. They stress clear documentation, explaining not just what the code does, but why it's done that way.
Good documentation is like a lifesaver for anyone else who has to work on that code base later. Saves so much time and frustration.
Yeah.
And speaking of preventing frustration, they talk about testing, which is obviously crucial for large applications.
For sure. And they stress having a solid testing strategy. Unit tests, integration tests, end-to-end tests. They say that layered approach is super important for catching bugs early.
Like a safety net. You find those errors before they make it to production and cause problems.
They even get into snapshot testing, which is really useful for React components specifically.
Right, it's like taking a picture of your component and making sure it doesn't change unexpectedly. And they're big on testing in different environments too, not just your local machine.
Of course. Just because it works for you doesn't mean it'll work the same way in production with real data and all the things that come with that.
It's like practicing a dance routine at home versus performing it on stage. Much higher stakes. They talk about automated testing too, right? As part of CI/CD.
Yeah, they say it's really important for making sure new code doesn't break things that were already working. They discuss tools like Jest and React Testing Library and Cypress for that.
Like having a whole team dedicated to making sure your code is always in good shape.
Exactly. And speaking of keeping your code in shape, a big chunk of the book is dedicated to building for scale.
And we're not talking about just like a few more users here. We're talking handling potentially millions without your app crashing and burning.
Yeah, it's a whole other level, like building a raft to float in a pool versus a cruise ship meant to cross the ocean.
So where do you even start with that? They mentioned load balancers, databases, caching. It's a lot.
It can be overwhelming, yeah. But think of it like this. Imagine you have a website and suddenly thousands of people are trying to use it. A load balancer is like the traffic director. It makes sure those requests get spread out over multiple servers so one server doesn't get slammed.
Makes sense. So it's sharing the burden.
Yeah.
What about caching? I know it's about storing data, but how does that make things more scalable?
Caching is all about speed, basically. Let's say you've got a product page on your site, right? And thousands of people are looking at it every minute. Instead of making your database work hard to get that product info every single time, you can cache it. Store copies somewhere, it can be accessed much faster.
So it's like Keeping the most popular book at the front desk in a library instead of making everyone go search for it in the stacks.
Exactly. And they get into different ways to do that, caching on the browser, caching on the server, even using tools like Redis, which is specifically for high-performance caching.
Okay, now they also mention these things, Docker and Kubernetes, which, I'll be honest, always sound kind of intimidating to me. How essential are those for React apps, really?
They're becoming more and more important, I'd say, especially as apps get more complex. Docker's like, think of it as a way to take your app and all the stuff it needs to run and put it in a nice little box, a container.
So no more, it works on my machine, but not anywhere else.
Exactly. And Kubernetes, that's like, imagine you've got hundreds of those Docker containers all running different parts of your app. Kubernetes is the conductor. It makes sure they're all working together. It can scale up or down if you need more or less power, all that.
So Docker organizes, Kubernetes conducts.
Yeah.
Start and get it. They make managing all that complexity easier.
Yep. And they work well with a lot of other tools and services too, which is nice. Another big thing the book gets into is monitoring, like how your app's actually performing.
Because what's the point of it being able to handle a million users if you have no idea how it's actually doing?
Exactly. They talk about setting up systems to track all the important stuff, how much load the servers are under, how fast things are responding, any errors popping up, even how people are using the app.
So you can spot problems before they become huge problems. I bet that's especially key when you've got a microservices architecture where all these little services talk to each other.
Oh, for sure. They say monitoring is key there to understand how all those services are interacting, where the weak points might be.
Like having a dashboard for your whole app.
Okay, so shifting gears a bit, another big part of building at scale is just like the robustness of the code itself, right? And in the React world, TypeScript has become huge for that.
They love TypeScript in the book, and I get it. Having those types in your JavaScript code can really help. Prevents errors, makes it easier for teams to work together. Like having a spell check, but for code, right? Catches the little mistakes before they become big ones.
Exactly. And it means that, for example, if a function is supposed to get a number, TypeScript will yell at you if you try to give it, like, a word instead.
Yeah.
Super helpful when you've got lots of people touching the same code.
Right. Keeps things consistent. And they say it actually helps make the code easier to read and maintain too, right?
Yeah, because with the type annotations, you can see right away what a function expects as input, what it's going to spit out. It's like built-in documentation.
Love that. And of course, they talk about how well TypeScript works with React, defining types for your props, your state,
Yeah.
even custom hooks, all that.
It's not like you have to relearn everything. It integrates really well. They present it as kind of the natural next step for JavaScript devs who are serious about React. Speaking of next steps, though, they don't shy away from the fact that sometimes with big apps, you got to make big changes. Migrations.
Ooh, yeah, migrations. Every developer's favorite word. Because we've all heard the horror stories, projects going way over time, over budget. It can be scary.
It can be, but the book does a good job of like breaking it down. They're big on planning, obviously,
Yeah.
clear communication, and having an actual strategy.
So, like, where do you even begin with a large-scale migration?
They say start by really understanding your current system, like what's working, what's not. Why are you even doing this migration? What's the goal? Are you switching to a new framework? Upgrading a database? Rewriting some huge chunk of code?
Got it. Know your why. Know what you're actually trying to achieve. And I think they talked about different migration strategies too, like the slow and steady approach versus the rip off the Band-Aid approach.
Yeah, they definitely prefer the incremental approach, if at all possible. They compare it to renovating a house. Like, you wouldn't tear the whole thing down at once, right? You do it one room at a time.
Less disruptive, you can still live in the house while it's happening. Makes sense.
Exactly. And testing throughout the whole process. You don't just want to make sure the new code works. You got to make sure you haven't broken the old code while you were at it. They recommend automating as much of that testing as you can too, so you catch problems faster.
Automated tests are your best friend during a migration, for sure. Now, they also talk about these things called code mods, which sound like they could be really helpful.
Yeah, a code mod is basically a tool that can do code refactoring for you. Imagine you have to go in and manually update like hundreds of files because some syntax changed, or you're using a new version of a library. A code mod can analyze your code and make those changes automatically.
Okay, that's amazing.
Yeah.
But they're not saying to just blindly trust code mods to do everything, right?
Right. They emphasize that they're tools, and like any tool, you got to use them carefully, understand what they're doing, test thoroughly, all that.
Like you wouldn't just pick up a chainsaw and start using it without knowing how, right? You need to be careful. Okay, this is getting kind of futuristic, but they even mention using AI for migrations.
It's early days for sure, but there's potential. Imagine you could describe your code base and the way you want it to be to an AI, and it helps you figure out the steps, maybe even generate some of the code for you.
That would be wild. But they're not saying AI is going to replace developers altogether, right?
No, definitely not. They stress that it's a tool, it can help, but you still need humans who understand the system, can evaluate what the AI is suggesting.
It's about humans and machines working together, I guess, which is interesting to think about. They wrap up by talking about engineering culture, too, which feels like a bit of a shift.
It's a really important point, though. They argue that you can have all the best tech in the world, but if the team isn't functioning well, the project's probably going to struggle.
Makes sense. Because at the end of the day, it's still people building this stuff, right?
Totally. They're big on communication, collaboration, making sure everyone feels comfortable sharing ideas, asking questions. That whole psychological safety thing is important.
Building that environment of trust. They talk about code reviews being important for that too, and mentorship, and encouraging people to keep learning and growing.
Exactly. Creating a culture where people are excited to do their best work, where they feel supported. That's how you build great things. And that actually leads really well into their final thought for the reader, which is kind of a step back from all the technical stuff.
So they spend all this time on the technical stuff, but then their final point is about the human side, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, it's easy to forget about that when you're deep in the code, but it matters so much. Building anything big, it's a team effort, and if the team isn't working, the tech doesn't matter.
It's like you can have all the best musicians in the world, but if they're not actually playing together, it's not going to sound good, right? It's the collaboration that makes it work.
Exactly. And even an orchestra needs a conductor, right? Someone to kind of set the tempo, make sure everyone's on the same page. Big software projects need that too, that leadership, that shared vision.
They talk about communication being so important, having good processes, using the right tools, making sure people can give feedback and actually feel heard.
And just being understanding of each other as humans. We all have good days and bad days, different ways of working. It's about more than just the code. It's about respecting each other, helping each other out when things get tough.
Because in the end, we're making things that hopefully other humans are going to use and find useful. And that takes empathy, right? Not just technical skills.
Yeah, for sure.
So, to everyone listening out there who's probably up to their eyeballs in React components right now, building these large-scale apps is hard, but it's also really rewarding when you get it right.
And you don't have to do it alone. There's a huge community of people who get it, who've been there. Don't be afraid to ask for help. Share what you're working on. We're all learning here.
Exactly. Keep building awesome stuff. And that's a wrap on our deep dive into building large-scale web apps.
See you next time.
Happy coding.